So I think we can go ahead and start it. Tonight we have Ian McGregor, Assistant Professor of Practice and Livestock and Irrigation, that will be talking to us about strategic supplementation in Oregon. Thank you for being with us, Ian, and good luck with your presentation.
Hey, thanks, Juliana. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about ruminant nutrition and strategic supplementation with people today. It's an area of passion of mine. Ruminant nutrition is a pretty thought-provoking and very interesting field of study. And considering that nutrition is typically the most expensive part of running a livestock operation, I would argue that it's kind of the most useful to know about. So yeah, let's start talking about ruminants. Ruminants have four stomachs, or not necessarily four stomachs, but they have four parts to their stomach. The first part being the reticulum, that is designed, it's right after the esophagus, and it's designed to capture larger particles to send back up to the mouth of the animal through regurgitation for them to chew on and make it smaller. The next part of the ruminant digestive tract is the actual rumen, which is kind of where all the magic happens. It's super interesting, and that's what we're actually super concerned about. It's the capacity is about 50 to 55 gallons, and you know, when you think about our stomachs, they're a very acidic environment, and the rumen is different in the sense that on a pH scale of 1 to 14, 1 being acidic and 14 being basic, the rumen pH usually sits at around 6 to 8. So it's a pretty neutral, almost basic environment, which is a lot different than our stomachs. And then after the rumen, you know, not as interesting, there's something called the omasum, which is a really dense organ that is used for getting moisture and water out of the digesta. And then after that is the abomasum, which is a lot like our stomachs. It's very acidic, probably at a pH right around 3. And so I think it's really important to understand how ruminant digestion and metabolism works, because once you're familiar with kind of how it works and the nuances and how ruminants have adapted to survive on low protein grass and, you know, still gain 1,200 pounds, you know, you can use that knowledge to your advantage so that when you spend a whole bunch of money on feed, you're able to get more nutrients out of that feed so it can go a lot farther and get more bang for your buck out of it. The other day I was hanging out with my friends. We were going to watch football, and I have a friend who is, you know, he's trying to lose weight and he's trying to eat healthy and stuff. And he quoted some bodybuilder guy, and this guy said that an ox can get to 2,000 pounds and eat nothing but grass. And so that was kind of his reasoning for going vegan. And I told my friend that's probably about the silliest thing I've ever heard. And I'm going to use this example for future presentations just to make an example out of that. It's funny because we're designed totally differently. Cows have a rumen that allow them to metabolize grass. The thing about grass, there's a lot of literature, particularly from, you know, depressing events in the past, like the Irish potato famine, where when people ran out of food or didn't have access to food, they tried to survive by eating the grass in their front yard. And because the enzymes that mammals produce, being humans or cows, they do not produce enzymes that are able to digest grass. However, when a calf is born, you know, up until the point to where it's able to wean itself from the cow and eat its own grass, what happens is that the mama cow is eating grass. And what happens is the mama cow kind of leaves this bacterial residue on the grass, and then the calf might come up behind it and nibble on the same piece of grass and inoculate itself with this bacteria. The calf did not make this bacteria. It got it from the environment. And this is the kind of bacteria that is able to digest forage. And so when I talk about strategic supplementation or just ruminant nutrition, particularly in the state of Oregon or the Pacific Northwest, I'll focus on the efficient use of feeding forages. Basically, you don't have, if you're in the Pacific Northwest, you can drive about 10 minutes and see a hay field. Pacific Northwest seems to be, a giant hay alfalfa field kind of thing. And so it's the most available feed stuff. You can find it for pretty cheap. I have producers who contact me sometimes and they're like, hey, I found this like really cheap hay on Craigslist or Facebook Marketplace or something. Should I buy it? And my answer to that is, I think if you know what you're doing, if you're, up to speed on your ruminant nutrition, I think you can come up with a really cool strategic way to take advantage of that low price on some low quality hay. But if you don't really know what's going on, maybe you should just leave that alone and buy some higher quality hay from your local co-op or something. For the purposes of this presentation, strategic supplementation in Oregon, we're really going to focus on the efficient use of forages and trying to squeeze as much energy and various nutrients out of the forage as possible. And so, hold on a second. This will go. Okay, here we go. A little presentation outline. First, we'll talk about how forage metabolism or metabolism works in the animal to kind of build a foundation of understanding for the strategies that I'll talk about later on having to do with protein and energy supplementation. So here we go, forage metabolism in ruminants. So think about a blade of grass. That's basically what grass plants are, a bunch of tillers, blade of grass. Grass by itself, it can stand pretty tall. It can support itself. I grew hay this summer that got to like 3 feet tall. It's able to stand pretty tall, and humans, yeah, we're able to stand pretty tall too. Just ask LeBron James. We have a skeletal system within us that allows us to stand really tall and not turn into like a puddle of connective tissue, essentially. But obviously grasses do not have a skeletal structure. The reason that grasses are able to stand as tall as they do is because of the fact that they are made of plant cells. And here in the upper right corner, you see a picture of a plant cell, and you might notice this thick green border around it. That is referred to as the plant cell wall, and the plant cell wall is made of what is called structural fiber. And so instead of a skeleton, these plant cell walls have structural fiber that allow the plant to stand at a certain height. The thing about this plant cell wall is that it's, like I said earlier, it's not digestible to enzymes that are produced by mammals. However, these cell walls are made up of 3 different types of fiber, that being hemicellulose, lignin, and cellulose. And out of those 3, hemicellulose is actually moderately digestible to the bacteria within the rumen. And so the idea is to create a rumen environment that promotes the existence of fiber digesting bacteria. And so throughout this presentation, kind of, when I say forage digestibility, that kind of, another word for that would be fiber digestibility, because the more fiber digestibility you get, the more forage digestibility you get. I like to use this analogy. It's called the Van Soest hotel theory. Look at this hotel here at the bottom right. It's kind of similar to a plant in the sense that, this hotel is basically made up of hotel rooms that are like stacked on top of each other, kind of similar to how in the plant, the forage, the plant cells are stacked on top of each other. So for the sake of this analogy, we can think of each one of these individual hotel rooms represented by the windows that you see in this picture as an individual plant cell. And so you can imagine if we take this hotel and we drop it into the aqueous environment of the rumen, into the rumen fluid, and we were to take a hammer and just smack a hole in one of those windows, the rumen fluid would be able to flood into that room and access everything that's inside of that room. Think about the hammer that I just mentioned as a bacterial enzyme. And so, by the rumen fluid gaining access to the inside of that room, that's essentially the rumen fluid gaining access to the nutrients within a plant cell. And so you can imagine when we have more bacteria that degrade plant cell walls, or I don't know, for the sake of this analogy, hammers, so to speak, then we are able to squeeze more nutrients or access more nutrients in a shorter amount of time than if we had less bacteria. So moving on, a little bit more about bacteria. It's interesting because rumen microbes actually, they're kind of like animals themselves. They have a metabolic requirement for nutrients, energy, and protein, just like we do. So the cool thing about ruminants is that they, as a calf, they nibble on the grass, they inoculate themselves with that bacteria. And what the rumen is, it's a perfect environment for the microbe to live and reproduce and just carry on its life. And then the animal continues to go pick up grass, which is basically the food that is appropriate for the bacteria. And so when the bacteria are able to get into the plant cell and they have access to the energy and protein, they're able to use it for their own purposes. And so basically what the animal lives off of for nourishment and nutrients is a byproduct of when the bacteria use energy and protein. And so what happens is, first of all, rumen bacteria, they require energy to be able to move, just like about any other thing. If you take away the energy source for your truck, which might be diesel, it's not going to move anymore. If you don't eat energy anymore, you're not going to be moving anymore. So in order for bacteria to move, they need energy. And in order for bacteria to acquire other nutrients, they need the ability to move. And so what happens is the bacteria, they eat the energy, now they're able to move. They create a waste product that is called a volatile fatty acid. The key word there being acid. The actual volatile fatty acid is used by the animal for energy, but it also, the accumulation of this volatile fatty acid creates an acidic environment in the rumen. And I'll note here that pH, the fluctuation of pH in the rumen has a profound effect on the digestibility of various nutrients. And generally an acidic environment in the rumen is really bad news for forage or fiber digestibility. So yeah, when you have like a more available energy source like corn or like rolled barley or something like that, it dumps into the rumen and it just like turns into acid like that. So moving on to protein, bacteria don't necessarily have a requirement for protein, but the thing that they actually use from the protein is a nitrogen molecule. And that's actually the main thing that separates a protein from a carbohydrate is the existence of a nitrogen on that chemical structure. And so what happens is the microbes will rip that nitrogen off of the protein, granted that they have the energy to do that. And they will use that nitrogen in order to reproduce and make more microbes. And so we said earlier that that's a really good thing because the more microbes you have, particularly the ones that like to digest fiber or forage, will help you get more nutrients out of low quality forages. Also, there's a twofold benefit to creating more microbes in the rumen, and that is that these microbes, they're actually made of roughly 50% protein. And it just so happens that the protein that is contained in microbes is a great amino acid profile for producing milk and meat for the animal. And so when we're increasing these microbes, the numbers of them in the rumen, we're able to digest more hay, and we're getting more of the highest quality protein for the animal that we can get. Okay, so we're gonna, now that we kind of have like a basic understanding of kind of how rumen microflora do their job, that's kind of help us understand some of these strategies that I'm getting ready to discuss. I guess we'll start with protein. It's important when you're thinking about feeding protein to your animals, it's important to distinguish rumen degradable protein versus rumen undegradable protein. And kind of like the name insinuates, rumen degradable protein is protein that goes into the rumen, and the microbes are actually able to access it and, you know, get access to the nitrogen and rip it off. Rumen undegradable protein is, you know, like the name implies, it goes into the rumen, and it's basically, it goes through the rumen completely untouched by microbes. It remains the same amino acid all the way through all the stomach compartments into the small intestine, and it's absorbed in the same form that it was fed. So every protein source, alfalfa, whatever commercial product you buy, it's all these protein sources are gonna have different levels of rumen degradable and rumen undegradable protein. And so that's an important thing to consider. I'd like to talk about this study done by my friend Tim Del Curto and others in 1990, where they had animals on dormant forage. It was dormant tall grass prairie. So if you can imagine, it's, you know, pretty low quality forage. And they were experimenting with different levels of protein to see which animals do the best or are able to take the most advantage of this really low quality forage the best. And so they had 3 groups of cows. One of them, they supplemented low protein at 13%, another group with medium protein at 25%, and then there was high protein at 39%. And what they found is that the cows receiving the medium protein at 25% increased forage digestibility the most out of all the treatments, and numerically actually increased forage digestibility by 30 to 40%, which is pretty crazy. It kind of, you know, increasing forage digestibility by 30 to 40% really makes this whole thing worth it. You can imagine if you're going to go buy a ton of hay for 180 bucks or whatever, and you get there and all of a sudden the guy you're buying it from is like, oh, here's another 600 pounds of free hay for you. That's basically the equivalent, and kind of trying to figure out how much protein leads to the highest forage digestibility. It'll really be worth it in the end. And I guess the issue with my presentation at this point is that this doesn't really give you an exact recommendation for you to try out this winter. Basically, the point that I'm trying to make is that, you know, maybe this hay or this winter when you're trying to feed hay, maybe have a couple of different groups of animals and maybe test out, you know, adjust your diets a little bit and kind of see which cows, first off, maintain body condition better. And also, if you're feeding hay in the bunk, you can kind of see how much hay they are eating. And so if cows are getting better utilization out of the hay that they're eating, theoretically, they should be eating a little bit less hay. Less hay will go farther if these cows are digesting forage a lot better. So let's look at these treatments and kind of talk about them. So the medium protein, 25% did the best. Obviously, the lower protein since the microbes use the nitrogen from the protein to reproduce, perhaps having a lower protein content may have impeded the potential microbial reproduction within the rumen. So perhaps these cows with the low protein content just had a lower number of individual bacteria in their rumen available to digest the low quality forage. And so what about the high protein? It's kind of expected that, if you give an animal more protein, it's going to gain more weight a lot faster. However, in this scientific experiment, I believe all of the dietary treatments, they wanted to keep the energy all the same. And so energy comes with protein. There's some certain amount of energy associated with a protein, particularly alfalfa or something. And so I imagine in this high protein treatment that they had to adjust the amount of energy that they were giving the animal. So it was different than the other two treatments. And perhaps, there is a problem with energy being available to actually, take advantage of the protein that was there. I think these results are really interesting because it kind of goes to show that just feeding your animals a ton of protein maybe isn't, the greatest idea in terms of being financially efficient. And, testing out different levels of protein is definitely worth your while this winter, just to kind of see if you can get more bang for your buck from low quality hay. Also, in the spirit of feeding protein to enhance forage digestibility, I would recommend that towards the late fall, as you're getting into winter and you have a whole bunch of dormant forage, it seems that you can actually increase the length of your grazing season by putting your animals on dormant forages that might be low quality nutritional wise, and leave them out there with some kind of cheap protein supplement, alfalfa, urea, whatever. And if that, who cares how much you put out there? If you have protein out there and rather than no protein, they're going to do a lot better, and they're going to be able to actually get more nutrients out of the low quality forages out in that fall pasture. Another really cool thing about ruminants is that when you do feed them a lot of protein, they'll split off that nitrogen. But if there's not enough bacteria for them to use all of that nitrogen immediately, then the excess nitrogen will go through the rumen wall and it'll go to the liver. Sorry, getting technical. And then depending on the nitrogen balance of the animal, a good portion of that nitrogen is going to exit the animal through the urine and feces. But here's the really cool part. Another portion of that nitrogen will actually be directed to the salivary glands of the animal, and there will be nitrogen in the saliva for the animal to swallow, and then you have nitrogen later in the rumen for the microbes to use. And so this goes to show that you don't necessarily need to have protein available every single day for your animals. If you check out some of these studies that I've listed below, they've compared growing steers receiving a protein supplement every single day versus receiving protein 1 to 3 times a week. And I believe the most extreme case was a study done in Texas. I don't know which one of these it is, but they tested steers getting protein every single day and steers getting protein once a week. And they actually had the same exact performance. So you still have to feed the same amount of protein to meet the requirements of your animal, but you don't necessarily need to go out there and do that chore every single day, which could save you a lot of time, particularly if you're somebody who is like renting pasture that is a significant drive away. That could save you a lot of fuel and time from having to go out there every single day. So yeah, that's something to think about. We'll move on to energy. So there's three things about energy that can have implications in forage or fiber digestibility. And that is the form of the energy, the source of the energy, and how that energy source has been processed. And here we'll start with the form of the energy. Here we're going to focus on sugar and starch. I guess you could argue that protein and fats are other sources of energy. The funny thing about feeding fats to ruminants or lipids or whatever is that they actually make like a coating. Here's the lipid and here's a feed particle. They coat feed particles, and that lipid fat layer of coating that I just mentioned is impenetrable to, by the microbes. And so you're covering it with fat, and all of a sudden the microbes can't get to it anymore. And it's recommended to keep lipids or fats in the diet below 2%. And so that's irrelevant to this conversation. And protein, it does have energy with it, but if you feed, a ton of protein, as an energy source, you're not gonna have enough energy. You're gonna be wasting a lot of protein. And I think that's pretty clear. So here we're gonna focus on sugar and starch. I actually personally did a whole lot of research on feeding sugar to ruminants while I was in grad school not too long ago. And I was studying the effects of sugar beets on steer backgrounding performance and sheep metabolism. And as I was getting ready to do my study, I was really excited because I was seeing all of this literature about how when you replace starch sources with sugar, it's supposed to increase fiber digestibility. And I was so excited to see this result. And there's so much, I could rattle off at least 3 studies off the top of my head where they fed sugar instead of starch, and they saw increased forage digestibility. And not just increased forage digestibility, but it was significant. So, to where you would actually want to try and do it. And I was really disappointed in my experiment because I did not see that result. In my experiment, I saw no effect of replacing sugar beets or replacing barley with sugar beets on fiber digestibility. I was kind of, astonished and kind of upset that I didn't see this result. So for a short period of time, I kind of became obsessed with looking at the studies that did see an increase in forage digestibility and kind of seeing where, why my experiment was different, or, kind of where I went wrong, so to speak. And if you look at these charts here, McGregor et al. In 2018 here on the left, that's me and the study I did in grad school. And then on the right, you have Arizona and others in 2014, where here in this bottom row, you can see that in Arizona's study, they actually increased forage digestibility by increasing dried shredded sugar beets in the diet. And you can see in mine, this bottom row, these numbers are numerically different, but they're not different enough to be considered significantly different. And so looking at these dietary treatments, you might notice that the chopped hay in my experiment, the forage or the fiber source is actually decreasing as sugar beets increased in the diet. However, in this other study by Arizona and others, their hay treatments, or the hay portion of their dietary treatments, stayed the same as sugar beets increased in the diet. And then they saw this increase in forage digestibility. And I think that goes to show that if you're going to try and feed sugar instead of starch, if you come across a sugar source like molasses or sugar beets here in the Pacific Northwest, that it really needs to be, the ration needs to be dominated by forages. I saw one study that made the claim that if you're going to try and do this, the diet should be at least 60% forage, whether that be hay or pasture, to support this effect of sugar on fiber digestibility. You might notice that, you know, in my experiment, I had no effect on fiber digestibility. But my numbers here in terms of fiber digestibility are a lot higher than the other treatment. But you'll also notice that the portion of hay that I had in my diet was a lot higher than the hay that they had in their diet. But yeah, so if you're wanting to feed sugar instead of starch to increase fiber digestibility, make sure that the diet contains a lot of forages so you can actually see a difference. And so we'll move on to the source of the energy. For the purposes of this presentation, I distinguish source of energy from form of energy, because perhaps the source of energy might be corn, barley, and oats. All of these have the same primary form of energy, which is starch. And although they are within the same family of having starch-based energy, they still have different effects on fiber digestibility. Here in this study, I'm not really too sure how to say this person's name, but it's a study that has been published, and this person was comparing different treatments of different levels of corn and barley and different dietary treatments, and found that when they fed corn to their animals, they saw a 12% higher fiber digestibility than feeding barley. And yeah, I'd say 12% is a high enough percentage that makes it worth exploring. And so I can't really put my finger on why, the whole scientific physiological background of why they might have seen this result. But the main point that I'm trying to make here is that maybe it would be worth like taking an assessment of the energy sources that are available to you to buy. And then maybe over the winter or whenever you're providing these supplements, you know, split your cattle into groups and, you know, try out these different energy sources and see what happens to their body condition, and see what happens to the amount of hay that is left in the bunk at the end of the day. Lastly, on energy, the processing of energy-based feedstuffs actually makes a big difference. You know, things like grinding, rolling, whatever processing method that takes this energy source and makes it a smaller particle size increases the surface area of the energy source, which, you know, at face value sounds like a wonderful thing. It increases the surface area that is available for microbes to be able to latch onto the feed particle and start using that energy. However, perhaps maybe not a great thing if we're trying to increase the fiber digestibility of the forage portion of our diet, because I think the most profound impact that this has is that if the bacteria are increasing the rate at which they are digesting or fermenting this energy, they are producing acid at a much faster rate, and the acidity in the rumen is just plummeting at a higher rate than if you didn't process that energy source. And so you're gaining a really acidic pH in the rumen, which I mentioned earlier is not a good thing for bacteria that digest fiber and forage. And so in studies, it has shown that increasing the surface area of your energy source does not support forage digestibility. Another impact that this has is that if the bacteria are fermenting and using this energy at a faster rate, that increases the passage rate of this energy through the rumen at a rate that probably exceeds, actually, I'm pretty sure it would greatly exceed the passage rate of the hay that you're trying to digest in the rumen. So the energy is leaving the rumen and the hay is still there. That energy source that you're trying to leverage into increasing your fiber digestibility just isn't working. So those are my points on protein and energy in the sense of like trying to meet the nutrient requirements of your animals. however, recently, since coming to OSU, I've come across a whole lot of different information, learning from different people, particularly a colleague we have at OSU who is actually one of the speakers earlier in this series. David Bonnert has done a lot of research on using supplements for, different goals, so to speak. And so still, resonating in the realm of, making better use out of your forage. Bonnert actually came up with this image here on the right, where you see, the different colors. The blue-green is like grasses of a higher protein content, and then the red-orange is like a lower quality forage with lower crude protein, and the dots are actual cows. And you can tell that the cows actually know where the good forage is. They're kind of congregated right around the blue-green areas. And in all likelihood, they're probably never even visiting these red-orange areas, which means if you have a huge pasture that has all these hills and topographical features, there's probably about 50 or 60% of the pasture that these cattle are never visiting, and there's grass growing there that is not being used. And so with a lot of this research going on that I've been talking about, it's been evident that you can take a supplement, whether that be like a protein tub, and the research that we're discussing, most of it has been with protein tubs, but I guess you could use molasses as well. Theoretically, you could use a salt block, but I think there's research showing that salt blocks are not as effective as using a protein tub or molasses or whatever. But by strategically placing these supplements in areas that cattle don't like to go to, all of a sudden they can be persuaded to go to that area and use those forages that they otherwise wouldn't be using. You can place these supplements to convince your cattle to start climbing hills that they otherwise would not be climbing. In this study by George and others in 2008, they were trying to use strategic supplementation to keep their cattle off of riparian areas. And they found that by strategically placing supplements away from the riparian areas, that they spent significantly less time in these riparian areas. So without the supplement, they were spending a lot of time trampling around these riparian areas, about 37% of their time. And then when they started using strategic supplementation, these cattle only spent 14.5% of their time in the riparian areas. And so not only were they spending less time in riparian areas, but they were using forages in other parts of the pasture that would not otherwise have been used. And so by strategically placing your supplements, you're able to get more bang for your buck out of your pasture. And I think that's something that's totally worth exploring, particularly if you have cattle in really large pastures with a lot of topographical features. And so I think that's about all I have for you guys today. It's 6:10, and I'll go ahead and open the floor for any questions.
Thank you, Ian. Very good presentation. I forgot to mention earlier at the beginning of the presentation, if you have questions, you can use the chat box or the question and answer box here at the bottom of your screen. I do have one question here, Ian, that I will go ahead and ask you. It's more related to logistics. So at the beginning, you mentioned about sugar beets. So where would people in Oregon can find sugar beets if they're interested in supplementing it?
Well, thank you for that question. Very good question, Juliana. And I particularly like it because of all the work I've done with sugar beets. So I'm totally ready to answer it. The funny thing about sugar beets is that, the Pacific Northwest and extending into Montana is great sugar beet country. And in some years, sugar beets are actually produced in quantities that are much higher than the actual demand. And so you have a whole bunch of sugar beets that are just piling up and going to waste, a lot of sugar beets that aren't even leaving the field. And so in years like this, which is, it's fairly common, livestock producers can actually get sugar beets for free or like next to nothing. Looking out for years of higher than average production would pay off for you if you live near somewhere where they're producing sugar beets. However, in years where there isn't this excess of sugar beets, perhaps it wouldn't be financially too smart to buy the sugar beets, because they'd probably be at a price that's way higher than what would actually make sense. And in those years, if you really wanted to try the whole sugar thing, I'd recommend working with a feed company to find some kind of molasses type supplement. So, yeah.
Okay, very good. I don't see any other questions on the chat or the question box. So if we don't have more questions, I would like to thank you for presentation, Ian. And just a reminder that next week, our webinar will be, oh, there's one more question here. So do you have information wet distillers grains?
So wet distillers grains are not particularly something I've worked with a lot. I do believe that when you use distillers grains and they go through the whole distilling process to make liquor, the whole point is to take the energy out of the grain to be converted into alcohol for the liquor. And so basically what you have with distillers grains after the whole distilling process, I believe it becomes a protein supplement at that point. However, the important question about that I don't really know the answer to is I would question how much rumen degradable and undegradable protein it has in there before I decide how I want to use it. But distillers grains are also a really cool thing that you can get for free if you make friends with your local distillers or brewers or whatever. Thanks, Shelby.
Thank you, Ian. So for next week, just a reminder, we are meeting on Thursday, the 5th, and we have Sergio Arispi and Morgan from Select Sires talking about EPDs and bull selection. Thank you, everyone, and see you next Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Bye.